bees. A lot of people, when I first start talking to them about bees, the search image they have in their head are these honeybees here. And when they find out that I spend all of my time identifying bees, it makes them wonder what I do. But bees are really diverse. You've got these green bees that you'll see in your garden a lot if you look, all sorts of different sizes, shapes. And when you start seeing some of the colors and different shape diversity, it really makes you think, like, what makes a bee? How do I know if I'm seeing a bee, a wasp, a fly, things like that? And so the first thing, if you're identifying invasive bees or any sort of bees in your yard, is seeing if you have a bee. You'll see flies a lot in your garden or out in nature. Flies have 2 wings, bees have 4 wings, so 2 pairs. So those are pretty straightforward to separate. Flies and wasps can be a little bit trickier sometimes. Not all bees have the big fluffy legs with pollen on them and things like that. But almost all bees will have branched or specialized hairs to collect pollen. And the real difference between bees and wasps, because there are wasps that will go to flowers and collect pollen, is bees will provision their nests with pollen. So they collect the pollen, bring it back, feed it to their potential young, where wasps will always feed their young meat or carrion, some sort of insect. So that's the big difference between bees and wasps. Bees, there are 20 to 30,000 species of bees worldwide, so they're extremely diverse. Honeybees, which is this one here again, that's just one species. We have one species of honeybee here in the US, and it's an introduced species. We actually don't have any native honey producing species of bees here. So honeybees, I think we all know, are important. We all, or most of us, like honey, and they've become important crop pollinators in massive plots of agriculture. But they are introduced. Something that I like to point out is often you'll see people talking about saving the bees while simultaneously saying, like, put honeybees in your yard. And I have nothing against honeybees, but saying saving the bees and putting a honeybee there is sort of like saying save native mammals, and putting a picture of a cow. They're pretty much livestock in the US, and so when thinking about protecting our native populations, we want to think about providing habitat for the bees that occur here naturally. Another thing to think about with bees, sociality is really uncommon in bees. The only social bees here in the US are bumblebees here on the right, and honeybees. So those are the bees that you think of that will have queens that lay all the young and raise them up. Most every other bee in the US are solitary or have really light sociality where they might communally raise their young, but they don't have caste systems. So every single female in our native bee species, except for bumblebees, can lay eggs and create a next generation. So, and some examples of solitary bee nests. You can see they're really diverse. Some of them you might not recognize as a bee nest, and it's one of the things that's important when thinking about looking at cargo or things like that coming into the U.S. and where you might find a bee that's not native to the U.S. Some of these, they can just look like little cotton balls, some little bits of mud. This one you can see it's just bored a little hole here in a seed pod. But because these are all solitary bees and every female can lay their own eggs, if one of these got over into the US, you could establish a colony, or not, it wouldn't be a colony, you could establish a population. So when thinking about transporting bees, it's really important to think about nesting. When you're looking at nesting, this is a bumblebee colony. So you can see that there's a lot of different eggs here being raised simultaneously together. There's usually a number of females helping take care of that. This is more what you see is a single female going in, creating a nest cell, provisioning it with pollen, and then leaving them for the next year. A really large amount of bees also, they'll nest in rocks or holes in rocks or the ground. If you think about ground nesting bees, they're going to be a lot less likely to be invasive somewhere, because you'd have to essentially move a bunch of dirt and happen to catch those to another country. So the ones we think about a lot of being potentially invasive are these ones that nest in sticks or rocks. So why do we want to protect our native pollinators? Honeybees have been great for a lot of our large crops, but there are a good number of crops that we're finding they're not the most efficient pollinators of, or they don't really pollinate. One example is squash. We have our native Pepinapis. Well, it used to be Pepinapis, now it's Eucera, but the common name is squash bee. These guys are great pollinators of squash. You can see you'll get piles of them in squash flowers. They'll often sleep in the squash flowers, so you're almost guaranteed to get pollination of the plant there when they're switching after sleeping in a pile of pollen. And another good example of a native pollinator that we need for a lot here is our bumblebees. So tomatoes are not pollinated by honeybees. You need a technique called buzz pollination to release the pollen in a tomato flower. So and so here's an example of that. They kind of buzz their abdomen, and you can see as they buzz, it just dumps the pollen out. If they don't have that buzzing, like the special technique that the bumblebees do, the pollen isn't released and tomatoes don't get pollinated. So even commercially, when we do greenhouse tomatoes and the tomatoes you're eating right now in the winter, those are all commercially raised bumblebees in greenhouses that pollinate those. Another example of a crop here in Utah that we use a lot that isn't pollinated well by honeybees is alfalfa. So we use Megachile rotundata, the alfalfa leaf cutter bee, to pollinate that a lot. And it's because if you look here, when they reach in for the pollen of the flower, it has a triggering mechanism. It flings the column up, and the honeybees hate that. So they find whatever way they can to not get hit in the face by this column of pollen, where a lot of our native bees and this Megachile rotundata, which is also an introduced species for pollination, doesn't seem to mind getting hit at all for some reason. It'll just dig its face in, get pollen all over it, and transfer that to the next plant, where the honeybees have figured out a good ways of delicately stepping around and getting the pollen, or either or also cutting into the back of the flower and doing what's called nectar robbing. So something to think of when we're thinking about keeping our native pollinators, or thinking about the pollinators we have. Now moving into more of the introduced bees, 80 species of bees have been introduced outside of their native range worldwide. 60 have been introduced to the US, 7 of them intentionally for pollination and honey, things like that. So a couple of those we've talked about. The other 53, which the vast majority, have been accidentally introduced. And the rate of introduction is happening a lot more frequently. If you look at the graph here, since 1990, about as many species have been introduced to the US as all the time prior to 1990. So as we're getting more global in how we ship commodities and travel gets easier, we're finding that a lot more bees are getting introduced with that. And so I'm going to delve into the families of bees a little bit, because it'll give you an idea of what families we need to be concerned about as possibly being invasive, and the ones that we don't need to worry about quite as much. The ones we don't need to worry about quite as much, as I mentioned earlier, are the ones that tend to nest in the ground. They're pretty hard to transport. Most of them were introduced before the 1930s, so they've been here for a really long time. And the ground nesting species that have been introduced that the best hypothesis I've heard of how they got here was in ship ballast, when they didn't have enough cargo to weigh down a ship before it sailed. They'd fill it sometimes with sand from wherever they were at, and then they'd dump sand when they got new cargo. And that's how people think some of these ground nesters got around, because it's pretty hard to transfer them. But these Andrenidae, there's only one species that's been introduced to the U.S. And it's not really a group that we worry about too much getting introduced again. Halictidae, very similar. A few more species have been introduced of Halictidae because they're much more common bees than the Andrenidae, but they're ground nesting, and so there aren't a whole lot of bees that have been introduced from that family. In the Callididae, we start getting into bees that are much more commonly invasive. The Calides and Copelacana in that group, we don't have to worry about, once again, ground nesting. But Hylaeus, you start getting into bees that nest primarily in stems like raspberries, and it just pithy, small stems that make it much easier. If they fall in the water, they can be float across bodies of water. We've found the Hylaeus in general, we've seen them in a lot of island systems move around that way. But the Callididae, we start moving up to 8 species that have been introduced worldwide. Now we start getting into the bees that we're really concerned about, and these are the bees that we've been creating guides for with USU. So narrowing it down to these groups that we think will likely be continued to show up here, and if we can catch them out as soon as possible, that's the best. So there are a good number of ground nesting bees in this group as well, but you have the carpenter bees in this group, which they're called that because they can dig into wood, they can dig into stems, they can dig into all kinds of things, and be transported that way. So they're the most commonly species or introduced species from this group is and they dig their own nests in pieces of wood. They can also be damaging to structures. If any of you've spent time on the East Coast, there's Xylocopa virginica. A lot of people are familiar with that bee out there because it'll dig holes in people's wooden sheds and things like that to nest. And so now you start seeing on the map, there's a whole lot more of these apidae that are moving around the world. And that's because of their nesting habits. And then the next group that we want to look at is the Megachilidae. These are your leaf cutter bees, resin bees, wool carder bees, mason bees. And they're really good at nesting in holes, crevices, almost anything that they can find. Some of them specialize in certain materials like sticks and things like that. And some of them will nest about anywhere. And these, you can see, once again, there's a whole lot of transfer in species around the world. So when focusing in on the US, most of the bees that have been introduced here are collected at our ports of entry, have come from Mexico, next closest Asia, and then down from there. We're finding that the transport method of the invasives found at the border is pretty evenly split between land, water, and air, which sort of surprised me. For the border interceptions, 6,000 bees were intercepted. Most of them were honeybees, but most of what was left, at least at the time we started our project, was not identified to species level. And that's sort of what encouraged us to start creating these guides so that more people could identify bees as they collect them. How they're coming in, most of it by far is on plant products. There's a category that the Border Patrol calls just at large, and I'm assuming that's they just found a specimen somewhere, not necessarily on a product. But the biggest place that they have connection to are fruit, vegetables, herbs, and then commodities is an important one as well, because we can find them on wood. Here's some examples of how they might sneak in. You can see here this piece of wood If it hadn't been cut into like that, you would never see this column of Xylocopa here coming up. They can just be kind of like mixed in with the stems. If you think of having a bigger bouquet of flowers or transferring a lot of flowers, it could be pretty easy for them to sneak in like this. It can be in snail shells. And these are some of the more unique ones I've seen of these ones in the bindings of books under flower pots. So these bees, especially in the Megachilidae that like to nest in crevices, can really sneak through without getting caught pretty easily. With all of that, the next question is, why do we care about invasive bees showing up? So big examples are pathogen spread. I'm guessing some of you have maybe heard of the Western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. It had a huge population crash a few decades ago, and we think that that's pretty likely because of transferring bees around. In this case, it was commercially used bees, Bombus impatiens, but it seems like some of the pathogens from that species transferred over into our native species and caused a population crash. And so that's something we really don't want. It's really hard to stop a pathogen once it gets in our system. And so the sooner we can detect these things and the more we monitor it and can make sure, watch the spread of some of these introduced bees, the more we can hopefully prevent that. Another thing that you can have is resource competition, especially in urban environments or drier environments where there's not a lot of flowers around. It can be a real limiting resource. Also nesting, a lot of these, if they came over nesting in stems or things like that, and if you're in a giant field, don't have nesting habitat for these guys, that the invasives can sometimes outcompete them. Another thing is that these invasive, or well, I guess they would be invasive if they're causing issues, but introduced bees, some of them, like I mentioned before, will nectar rob. And so you can see here this Megachile sculpturalis, which is one of the big invasives right now, will, instead of going in, taking the pollen the way it wants you to, or wants a bee to spread it, it'll cut into the back of the flower and just take the nectar and not get the pollen on it. And so you can get reduced pollination of our native plants because the invasives aren't used to those, but they still want the nectar. So to take the nectar, there's no reward for the native bees to visit that plant anymore. So another issue with introduced bees is we've found that some of them like plants from their native habitat a lot more. And so introduced species, so we've particularly yellow star thistle we've looked at, where the invasive Megachile apicalis really likes yellow star thistle and is a good pollinator of it, and yellow star thistle is an invasive plant, and they're working together to spread both of them, it seems. And so those are things to look at with those. So there's a few examples that we've seen of bees causing issues, like this Megachile sculpturalis. It actually pulls other bees out of their nests, takes over native bee areas and things like that. But of the 60 bees, there are 5 or 6 examples of introduced bees causing real issues with the native populations. Most of them, we've looked at it, doesn't seem like there's a significant impact. They haven't brought in pathogens that we can find. So most of these are things we don't have to worry about long term, but it's good to be aware of species as they come in, because some of them can cause issues. The main thing to think about when thinking about introduced bee populations is if more bees are introduced to a system, we're going to need more floral resources and more nesting resources. So the more we can do to increase native bee habitat, the more protected they'll be. The other thing that some invasives can do is they can be territorial of areas. This next this little video I'm going to show you guys is something that if you have lamb's ears in your yard, the plant, I can almost guarantee you'll see this behavior. There's an invasive Anthidium, Anthidium manicatum. It's a wool carder bee that the males will guard this plant. And you can see if you watch for long enough, they'll do this patrolling behavior, which is kind of these jerky zigzag movements through the flowers. And then if any other bee comes in, they try to take it out of that area. So let me show you this. This is just in my yard here. So yeah, that's just an example of a bee that would be invasive. It's spread really aggressively through the US. And does show, it does have an impact on whatever bees would naturally be visiting that plant. But just to re-emphasize, a majority of the introduced species we haven't found negative interactions with. It's just keeping an eye on the ones that do. And so, as I mentioned before, a lot of the bees that were being collected even on cargo that we were pretty sure were non-native bees, we didn't really have a great way to have people at ports identify these bees as they came in. And so we've been working over the last 5 years or so to start creating user-friendly guides on how to ID some of these bees that are coming in. A big focus on these guides have been the photos. So we've made sure that everything we have reference material for, we take pictures, we put it on the website, we take pictures of the key features, and our hope is that that's going to reduce the expertise requirement coming in, because if you work with identification at all, you know that there's a lot of specific terminology for everything, and each group it changes around. And so we're hoping that every time we say a new word that someone might not know, having a picture right there of the feature with arrows and things like that about what we're talking about, it's going to make identification a lot easier for people. So on the website we've been creating, we talk about the basics of identifying if it's a bee or anything different right off the bat, and then move into bee biology, how to process and pin bees that you collect, because unfortunately bee identification all has to be done under a microscope. A lot of the features are pretty hard to see out in nature, and so getting them prepared well to look at it under a microscope is important. We have glossaries with all the terms that we'll be using, which when I started with bees was something I really wanted. There's not a good place with just all the bee words, or there wasn't a good place with all the bee words gathered together, so you could learn them all in one spot. But we've created guides to a good number of these groups that we've talked about in the Megachillidae and the Apidae. So the ones that we've seen, 90% of the invasive species or introduced species come from. We've got guides to the subgenera and if needed species. Most of these just identifying it to the subgenus, you can say whether or not it should, or it's native to the US. And so this is an example of sort of what these guides look like. Every time we talk about an identification character, we have a picture of it. And you can see the pictures of the bees that you're narrowing it down to here on the side as you move through the keys. So just some more examples where you might not know what the basal area of the propodium is, but we have a picture here to show you sort of the back of the thorax and where you try and find that feature on the bee instead of having to know all the terminology right away. They're really dense keys. You don't have to worry about this part so much when using them, but on our side, they're a lot of work. People have found the matrix keys really helpful, but if you think about when we do just one of these keys, the one to the Megachillidae, there's 76 genera, 339 character states. So we have to keep track of 26,000 boxes, and hopefully none of those are checked wrong. So it's a good amount of work to work through these keys, but hopefully, and I've gotten feedback that it's made things a lot easier for folks. We also have fact sheets. Once you narrow it down to a group, you can click what you've narrowed it down to, and it'll give you a description of everything. It'll tell you bees that you might confuse it with. Just to double check some of the stuff, we've included references for all the bees we've included. So if you want to dig in more, that's all available there. It's really dense information, but it's nice to have it all in one place, I feel. And so that leads to the last bit of this, of what do we do about invasive bees that are already in the US? And the big thing that we want to focus on is making sure that they're not pushing the native population out. And so the more flowering perennials, annuals that you can have in your yard, and the more habitat that we can have unfragmented, the more likely they are to not impact our native populations, because those resources will be there. So there are a lot of other resources for bee identification that if you want to double check, or if you just want to delve into it a little bit, Bees in Your Backyard is a really useful entry-level book. It's got a lot of beautiful pictures. Joe Wilson, who's also out of USU, he's in Tooele, and Olivia Messenger put together this book, and they have this really cool technique where instead of taking pictures of dead bees, which is what we often have to do in museum collections, they chill the bees just so that they're slow enough to get a picture of, take a photo of them, and then they go on their way. So it gives a lot more natural, what you're going to see out in your yard look. So that's a really good book to look into. USU Extension has a whole lot of resources on their website. I found that this gardening for native bees thing is really useful. Jim Kane, one of our scientists at the USDA ARS, put this together. He goes through and talks about flowers, when they're flowering, through the season, because one of the things you want to focus on in supporting native bee populations is having plants year-round for them to visit. And so it kind of goes through each plant that is good for the bees and what their blooming season will be and things like that. So that's a really good resource. There's our site, the idtools.org. Often I'll just Google exotic bee ID, because there's a lot more to type in there. It's a government website. Sometimes they don't quite roll off the tongue. And so ID Tools is the website that we've been doing, that I've showed you those keys on. iNaturalist and Discover Life are great places to get your bees ID'd if they're really common. iNaturalist is a good resource to just take pictures of things. It records them all. There's actually a surprising number of bee experts on there that can go through and will give you an idea of what bees you have. And then Discover Life you can look at the ranges of all of these bees. So both of those are good sites in combination with each other. And then Bees of the World is kind of the bee Bible for all of this. It's a big fat book, but if you're wanting to go to the level after some of these easier guides and dig in a little bit, it's an amazing book. And just want to thank, we've been doing this for 5 years, and there have been a lot of people that have worked on this project, and USDA has given us facilities. APHIS has been really helpful, and USU has been helpful through the whole process. So I think I sped through some of that, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Skyler. I think you probably will be changing your headphones so that you can hear me, and we'll let Skyler do that. And while he is doing that, I am going to paste the link to the evaluation and the information for CEU credit is in chat. So I just put that there. So you can click on that and look at it at your leisure. But once Skyler's ready with his headphones, and we can do some questions.
I think I'm all right. I can hear you now.
You can hear me? Okay. Are you able to turn
sorry
on
about
your,
all those issues.
Yeah, are you able to turn on your camera?
Yeah, let's turn that back.
We do have a few questions, and maybe as we go, there'll be a couple of more that might come in. The first one is the definition of invasiveness, and I think this was asked when you were talking about interceptions of bees. So the question is, are you defining invasiveness by its transport from other countries? I'll just read this whole thing, or can you see it? In the Q&A, there's actually several questions within this one. So first off, the first one is, you're defining invasiveness by transport. Maybe start with that. Yeah, so I tried for the most part to say introduced with a lot of these. I know sometimes I slip and say invasive. I think I said both a number of times, and it's because that is a tricky term to define. And I've been trying to, when I say invasive and then switch back and say introduced, it's because a lot of these ones that I don't think, well, it doesn't seem are harmful, they're not aggressively spreading or things like that, I would consider those more introduced, where invasive are, I would consider more the ones that we're seeing effects on native populations. We're seeing aggressive expansion, and something that, in order to prevent that from continuing, we would have to take some action, probably. Okay. There haven't been any examples yet of us taking action against a bee. It's sort of a tricky area of a lot of them will pollinate still and things like that. The one I would be the most worried about is the one I mentioned a few slides ago, of the Megachile sculpturalis. It's one of the quickest expansions I've seen. It's an Asian bee. It's huge. It's about the size of a carpenter bee, so over an inch long. And we've seen it pulling native bees out of their nests. We've seen it nectar robbing. We've seen it doing a lot of things that we wouldn't want to see a bee do. Maybe you could go back to that picture. Yeah, let's do that. So that one is a great example of one that is definitely invasive. Let's see, this Anthidium manicatum that I talked about, I would call that invasive as well. It's spread across the entire country now, and we've seen it do a lot of territorial behaviors and fight out native bees. Yeah, because it wants to protect the pollen source. Yeah. Yeah. So it is. Well, it is going after other bees, not just within the species. Yeah. Okay. Any bee that you watch land on that plant, it will attack. Okay. And pretty reliably too. It's interesting to watch. So I would recommend anyone that has lamb's ears or knows where some is, just watches it this summer. You'll almost guaranteed see some of these Anthidium manicatum. That's how common this invasive bee is now. Yeah. I've watched them too. I was wondering, would you recommend taking out lamb's ears? No, I wouldn't, because they're so specific. At this point, if you plant lamb's ears, you're probably not going to get a lot of native bees on it. So I wouldn't say plant that to bring in a bunch of natives. But because the Anthidium manicatum is so specialized on that lamb's ears, I'm not seeing that behavior on even a plant right next to it. They're not guarding that. They're very specifically protecting the one plant. So that makes sense. It's not a good one to plant to add diversity to your yard. But if you want to have a guaranteed Anthidium manicatum that you can show people that that behavior, you can put it in your yard. Okay, so back to this first question in Q&A, another part of it. So a genus, you mentioned Hylaeus, they nest in twigs, and she said, why is that bad? And I'm sure it's because of the transport. Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's bad. We have plenty of native Hylaeus that nest in twigs, and it's
a good place for them to nest. It's just an easier way for them to be transported. If they can
Okay.
nest in a twig, if you have dried flowers or any sort of transport, if you it's just an easier way to move the bee across an ocean or something like that if they're in something that can be moved as easily versus one that nests in the ground where you'd have to dig up a whole bunch of sand to move the bee to another country. So
Got it. Okay.
that just goes more into the bees that nest in cavities and crevices versus in the earth are going to be transported a lot more easily.
Yeah. And yeah, from one country to another. Okay.
Yeah.
And then just to be clear, we have some non-native bumblebees as well.
We don't have any non-native bumblebees.
Okay. So maybe that
so-
was a someone thought they saw some bumblebees listed in the group that are invasive.
Let me check my list really quick. Here's my list of invasive. Yeah, there's no bumblebees.
Okay.
The example that I used of the pathogens being spread to the West Coast, that was an eastern bumblebee. So given the size of the U.S., you can say that the Bombus impatiens that are out west, they are introduced. This is not their native range. For a while, they thought that they were containing them just in greenhouses, but we have been seeing spread into native populations, and we've seen wild populations of Bombus impatiens now. So you could call that one introduced from the East Coast to the West Coast.
Okay. All right. So we still have a good bit of questions to go through. Do invasive bees affect local honey beekeepers?
Only in that they're competing for the same resources. Like I said, honeybees are also introduced, but we wouldn't call those invasive because we want them here. But there is a real chokehold with honeybees in an area that doesn't have a lot of flowers, which is often a thing that we do. We'll ship a bunch of honeybees out into a field that there's just a crop that's blooming at that time that we want pollinated. As soon as that crop's flowers die out, say you move 10 hives, that's 1 million or so bees that we've added to an environment that are all going to compete over the same resources. So the more introduced bees you add to that as well, the more competition for those resources there's going to be. And so that's why I was saying the biggest thing we can do to help that is provide more resources for the bees. Especially with honeybees, I have no problem with honeybees when people provide flowers for them. But if you just dump down a bunch of honeybee hives and you haven't thought at all about providing resources for those honeybees, they're going and competing with the native bees in that area.
And yeah, that makes sense. So there was a question about, you can buy these bee houses for solitary bees. Do you think there's any concerns about, the question was inadvertently helping introduced or invasive bees instead of native bees?
Yeah, and that's a question I get a lot about those bee houses. And the thing about it is those introduced bees are going to be competing for those nesting resources in your nest house or outside of it. So what you're doing by providing one of those nesting blocks is just providing more nesting resources in general. So you didn't bring the bee in by putting that nest box there. It was already searching for a nest. So it would have found another hole that a native bee might have used. So because we aren't doing anything right now to get rid of the introduced bees, I don't think providing or letting them stay in a bee block like that is dangerous, because you're just providing more resources for both the introduced and native bees.
Okay. Now, I know our honeybees drink a lot of water that we might put out, but do native bees need a water source?
They do.
Okay, what's the best way for that?
In my yard, I have bird baths, and I figure they can get their water from there. I've seen people that have little ponds and things like that, and you'll often see, especially if there's a honeybee hive nearby, the honeybees going for it. But native bees do need water for both drinking themselves and especially the ones that are constructing nests out of mud. They need water to mix with the dirt to make mud to make their nest cells. And so water is an important resource for bees.
Okay, so back to the bee homes. This question asked about wooden straw. I don't know that there are wooden straws, but I know there's just the plain wooden blocks.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think they're probably, I'm jumping around in slides here, but
that's all right.
If we go back to that slide we were looking at, that is a style that of nest habitat that people will do. So if you go and find pithy stems, anything like, you can use raspberry stems, you can use anything up in the canyon that kind of has that easy to hollow out center. If you just cut those into like a foot long length and put them somewhere in your yard, bees can nest in those. So I think that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, so that's a good thing.
But yeah, you can see that here.
All right, so does APHIS PPQ have to check for bee introductions in shipments, or do their detections fall under insect inspection in general?
They do check at borders on shipments. And so you can see here some of the shipments that they've found nests on. So those are all at ports of entry. So I think that the thoroughness isn't necessarily there at every entry. I mean, we've gone through ports, I'm sure. Well, yeah, many people have gone through and they just kind of wave you through it. And so that can be hit or miss on how thorough they are, but they should be checking for things like this. But it can be pretty subtle. And so that's one of the things we've tried to do in training the people inspecting these things. They can be in a snail shell or a little stick. And so looking for holes and things like that is important.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the last one is, so with weeds, you can have noxious weeds and invasive weeds. So are there those levels of invasive terms for insects?
I haven't heard any used. I haven't seen that classification in the bee world. And even in the bee world, there's not a solid like master list that we keep like they do with noxious weeds. And I think that's something we could do to improve how we're looking at these things. Because like I mentioned, a lot of the ones that have been introduced, we know that they have small populations in a state somewhere, but they don't seem to be spreading. They don't seem to be causing a lot of harm. And it would be good to classify that against something like Megachile sculpturalis, or there's some other ones that have been introduced. Like on the East Coast, there was one that was introduced with an intentionally introduced bee. Osmia cornifrons is used to pollinate out there and was brought in from Asia because it's a good pollinator of some crops. But then there's a bee that looks pretty close to that one, uses the exact same size holes, has very similar features, and they just didn't identify it right coming in. And so they brought in that bee with it. And it's now become, in the native systems, we see a lot more of the invasive one that was introduced with the intentionally introduced one than we're seeing with the intentional one. There's a similar example, the leafcutter bee out here, the alfalfa leafcutter bee, Megachile rotundata. There's a really similar looking one in the same subgenus, Megachile apicalis, that was introduced with that, and that's what we're seeing help the spread of yellow star thistle because they specialize on yellow star thistle.
Wow.
But that came along with an intentional introduction. It was just mis-IDs in bringing those intentionally introduced bees over.
Okay,
that got these other ones in.
Yeah, it takes a keen eye.
Yeah, and it's pretty straightforward to separate those two bees when you're looking at them closely. But the keys for them were not readily available for a while. You'd have to dig through a lot of literature and things like that. So that's why we're trying to make it a little bit more accessible.
Yeah, I've seen that website. It's great, the work that you're doing. So there's no more questions left, but we really, really appreciate sharing your expertise. You've been great, Skyler. And if you want to show your last slide, I think you had your email address there, in case someone had a question, they could perhaps contact you. I'm not sure if you had it on
May have
there.
had it on there, but I can add it to the chat really quick.
Okay. Yeah, while you do that, I'll just say, in case no one's looking at the Q&A, there were some comments about a book called Bees, an Identification and Native Plant Forage Guide as being a good one. And then someone else, I think this is really cool, said a soaker hose that, of course, is plugged on one end and has water in it is a really great water source. All right,
Yeah,
well,
I've seen a lot of good. If you're not wanting to put out a bird bath or things like that, I've seen people just use the bases of flower pots and things like that. You don't really need to put a ton out. They won't use it super quick. It's more likely it'll evaporate quickly. But